Half an hour, part two of the thriller serial set in Scotland, The Morning Brooch. But first, the main news with Kenneth Kendall.
Good evening. First, more killings in Northern Ireland. Outside Armagh jail, a woman prison officer is killed and 3 others wounded. In Belfast, an army cadet officer is shot dead. Exclusive first pictures of the kidnapped British bankers, filmed by their captors in Central America. They seem well, and there's evidence the film is recent. Unemployment is down by 61,000. It's the second biggest fall since the war.
In the election campaign, the two main party leaders take issue over unemployment. The Prime Minister says jobs must be protected against the Conservatives returning to free market forces. Mrs Thatcher says Tories hate unemployment. It's Labour's heavy taxes and bad laws which have destroyed jobs. And 2 former Prime Ministers add their voices to the battle of words.
In Northern Ireland, 2 more people have been killed in attacks by the Provisional IRA. In Armagh, a woman prison officer died and 3 others were wounded, 2 seriously, in a gun and grenade attack outside the women's prison. And in Belfast, a visiting army cadet officer was killed, while a 19-year-old cadet and an elderly woman shopper were wounded when gunmen opened fire. The part-time cadet officer was a full-time teacher at a school at Ware in Hertfordshire. He was Captain Paul Rogers, aged 37. The woman prison officer who died was Mrs. Agnes Wallace, who was 40. She was the first woman prison officer to be killed since the Troubles began. Christopher Morris reports.
The ambush was at lunchtime as 4 women officers, all in uniform, left Armagh jail. It was a hand grenade hurled from a passing car that killed Mrs. Wallace, the mother of 6 children. And in the attack, her 3 companions were also injured. There were 3 men waiting inside a blue Ford car which pulled out from a nearby street as the women left the jail. At least 6 shots were fired at them before the grenade exploded. The murder follows that of a Belfast prison officer at his sister's wedding only 3 days ago. Armagh is a top security women's prison, notably where the Price sisters are serving life sentences for the Old Bailey car bomb explosion in London 6 years ago. The jail is close to the Irish border, which was sealed off within minutes of today's outrage in a bid to trap the killers. In Belfast, Captain Rogers and an army cadet were ambushed near the Royal Victoria Hospital after visiting a soldier seriously wounded yesterday. Both were due home tomorrow. From this house, the gunmen opened fire as they drove past, and a woman pensioner out shopping was also critically injured. Shortly afterwards, the gunmen's stolen car crashed into a taxi, and in the panic to escape, they threw their rifles away over the wall of a convent school. Today's murders bring to 12 the number of people killed in Northern Ireland during the past fortnight. Another soldier shot last week died in hospital today.
The Provisional IRA are obviously stepping up their campaign of violence as the general election itself draws nearer. Today's shootings follow the examples earlier this week of attacks against the police when the 4 men were blown up and killed, and yesterday's shooting when another soldier was injured in the Turf Lodge district.
There were full military honours at today's funeral of Constable Robert Lockhart, one of the 4 policemen killed by the huge IRA bomb on Tuesday. At the funeral service, the preacher said the fiendish murders focused the dangers to which security forces were subjected as they strove to maintain law and order.
Guerrillas holding 2 British bankers hostage in Central America have released the first film of the men. The film, exclusive to the BBC, shows the men under heavy guard but apparently in reasonable shape. The bankers, Michael Chatterton and Ian Massey, have been held for 4.5 months. The guerrillas in El Salvador threaten to kill them unless their bank, Lloyds International, pays a big ransom. Kate Adey reports.
This 8mm film was shot by the guerrillas in San Salvador. Grim pictures which show for the first time the 2 British hostages, Ian Massey and Michael Chatterton, guarded by men with automatic rifles, pistols and grenades. The men, who work for the Bank of London and South America, a subsidiary of Lloyds, are held by a terrorist group known as FARN, the Armed Forces of National Resistance. They were kidnapped last November on their way to work in the capital, San Salvador, victims of the violent struggle between a right-wing military government and Marxist terrorists. The Farn guerrillas have amassed millions in ransom money from a string of similar kidnappings, and they want £5 million each for the two Britons. Ian Massey is 46, married with 2 sons and a daughter. He comes from Edinburgh and is the local manager in San Salvador. His deputy, Michael Chatterton, is a year younger and comes from London. He's married with 2 sons. Both men look relatively well, but they've been held now for 4.5 months. They have books and newspapers and are seen holding a copy of Newsweek, published on March the 5th. This supports the guerrillas' claim that the scene was filmed on March the 20th. For on the 21st, this third hostage was found, with a bullet in the stomach, an elderly Salvadorian coffee merchant, Ernesto Libas. His body was dumped in a car in a suburb of the capital. The 4th man held by the guerrillas was a Japanese businessman. He was freed 2 weeks ago after payment of a £6 million ransom. But Massey and Chatterton are still confined, probably somewhere on the outskirts of San Salvador. Ever since their abduction at gunpoint outside the bank, negotiations have been bedeviled by the guerrillas' insistence on political demands, as well as ransom money. Lloyds say they're powerless to implement any political or propaganda demands, and the British government is kept out of the affair. Officials from Lloyds viewed our film, identifying their colleagues, then explained the present state of negotiations.
Well, right now we are out of contact with the kidnappers, and this is the result of the fact that at the end of March they broke that contact off. And so we are without recent news of the condition of our men.
Are you in a position to say, though, that you're trying to get into contact with them, that you're trying to make some sort of, to get in touch with them?
We have made it abundantly clear in the last contact that we had that we are anxious to negotiate a settlement for the speedy release of our colleagues. And indeed, in that context, we did make a very substantial financial offer. It is the Farn who've broken off the contact, not us.
With 1 hostage now released and 1 hostage murdered, the most recent communiqué on the bankers from the terrorists talked about negotiating for the last time. The bank remains hopeful. However, the terrorists have never deviated from their threat that the men will be executed if their demands are not met.
There's been another big fall in unemployment. The number of people out of work in the United Kingdom now stands at just over 1,340,000. That's 61,000 fewer than in March, the second biggest monthly improvement since the war. Our industrial correspondent says the drop is almost wholly due to adults getting work. He says the best guide to unemployment, the seasonally adjusted figure, fell by nearly 40,000. The whole problem of unemployment has now become a focal point in the election campaign. Over to our political editor, David Holmes, in our election studio.
We sensed yesterday the Prime Minister thought the unemployment figures looked good for Labour. He invited journalists to look out for them. Today, he said quietly, I am content to let Labour's case be judged on the facts. And he went on to assert that the great majority of the unemployed were out of work for no fault of their own, because unemployment was not just a British problem, but a worldwide problem. 17 million out of work in the major industrial countries, rising over the past year in France, Sweden, Holland, Belgium and Italy, but falling in Britain. And that was a product, said the Prime Minister, of Labour's economic strategy, its measures to protect jobs and to build new ones for the future. Tonight, he took up the theme again.
I said today, some of you may have seen it on the television if they reported it, that we brought unemployment down at a time when in countries like France and Belgium and Italy and Holland and Sweden, unemployment's been going up. But measure the size of the task still confronting us, not only in this country, but in Europe as a whole, over the next 5 years, in the countries of the European community. 9 million more people will be joining the labour markets than will be leaving it. 9 million more people looking for work. And let us weigh that when we are considering whether we can return to those fly-blown policies of the 30s, the operation of the free market forces to which Peter Owen referred, as to whether we can trust the jobs of our people to that kind of hit-and-miss system. I say we cannot and we dare not, and we must on the 3rd of May take the decision that we shall not return to that.
For Mr. Jim Pryor, the Conservatives' employment spokesman, any improvement on unemployment figures was welcome. But he added that the government's target had been to halve the numbers of jobless people by this year. Today's figures didn't bear this out. At Leith, Edinburgh, Sir Keith Joseph, the Conservatives' party policymaker and spokesman on industry, visited a job centre. He had strong views about one aspect of general unemployment when he gave his reaction to Labour's attitude.
I think it's mad to discourage the creation of jobs, as this government is doing, by such high taxation on those who succeed and run businesses. It means that some of them don't expand their businesses, and therefore there are fewer jobs. And then it's mad to put such heavy taxation on people who work, because there are jobs available that people won't take.
But the Conservative view of the unemployment issue came more formally from Mrs. Thatcher in Birmingham tonight. She didn't deal in detail with today's figures, but she said how she believed that Tory policies would turn things round and make for a substantial drop in unemployment. If they didn't do so, Britain would not just be down in the 4th division, she'd be out of the game altogether.
We Conservatives hate unemployment. We hate the idea of men and women not being able to use their talents and abilities. What a waste it is, and what an affront to people's dignity to be out of work through no fault of their own. We're accused of wanting unemployment to solve our economic problems. Who by? A government which has itself produced the highest unemployment since the war. Now, there's nothing inevitable about rising unemployment. The next Conservative government will reverse the job-destroying effects of Labour's measures, heavy income taxes, penal capital taxes, and bad laws like Michael Foot's misnamed Employment Protection Act. That act is the greatest deterrent to taking new staff on board since Noah had just one ark for the whole of the human race.
Later in her speech, Mrs. Thatcher spoke about law and order and said a Conservative government would enter into a partnership with the law-abiding people of the land. It would be a partnership to see that courts were respected again, police morale restored, wrongdoers punished, the law upheld, and more effective help given to the victims of crime. At the end of her speech, Mrs. Thatcher was given a standing ovation. Now, Mrs. Thatcher's predecessor, Mr. Heath, spoke in London tonight, continuing his campaign in full concert with the party leader. People were frustrated, he said, by the seemingly endless failures of the last 5 years. To so many people today, life seems purposeless, he said. A new government, a fresh approach was needed.
Hope for the future over these 5 years has been ebbing away. It is hope that we now have to rekindle for all our people. Hope and the belief that we can win through. That is what we have to show. Britain has got to regain confidence in herself. Go to any country in the world that is making a success of it. And what do you find? You find the people full of confidence and brimming over with hope for the future. This, above all, is what this election is about.
Making much rarer appearances in the campaign is Mr. Heath's old rival, Sir Harold Wilson. But tonight he was speaking in South London. He supported the Labour Party for its public spending plans, and he attacked Mr. Heath for the increases of 6 years ago.
I would like to see the Labour Party go over to the attack on this question of public expenditure. After all, the most expensive addition to the burdens that have been put on the taxpayer and the ratepayer were the results of doctrinaire decisions taken against strong Labour warnings, and we voted against them, decisions taken by the Conservative Cabinet in 1973. Now, it's no good them saying, "Please, sir, it wasn't me, it was Edward Heath." every member of the Tory front bench who was a member of that cabinet or of that government carries full collective ministerial responsibility.
The Liberal leader, David Steel, in a speech tonight, warned against expecting too much of the pre-election promises being made by either Labour or Conservative parties. He said they couldn't be achieved while Britain was suffering from its present economic failure.
Because the economic failure is starving this country of the kind of rewards to which we are entitled. You will hear from every platform, Liberal, Labour, Conservative and everything else, promises of what might be done. And you should take them all with a pinch of salt, because there will not be improved pensions. There will not be an improved death grant. We will not tackle the problems of the one-parent families. We will do none of these things. We will not put money into the health service, into education or anything else, unless we can turn this country from economic failure into economic success, because the money will not be there.
The Liberals' former leader, Jeremy Thorpe, has been pursuing a more lonely campaign. David Steel sent a recorded message to his adoption meeting, but there's been no help in person from any of the Liberal leadership. Not until today, that is, when Mr. Thorpe received a visit from the party's economic spokesman, John Pardoe. For Mr. Thorpe, whose trial has been put off until after the election, it must have been a welcome gesture of support, as well as a chance to discuss election strategy with one of the party's policy makers. So far, no other leading Liberal has an engagement to speak for Mr. Thorpe. The former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Robert Mark, found himself in the middle of an election controversy today. It all started with a magazine article he's written in Security Gazette, in which he said that the way in which the government of the day had changed the law in favour of the unions was not unlike the way the Nazis gained control of Germany in the 30s. And he accused the Conservatives' employment spokesman, Mr. Jim Pryor, of respectfully touching his forelock to the unions too. It was all put to party leaders at their news conferences this morning. After his first reaction, Mr. Whitelaw, the Shadow Home Secretary, was pressed about the criticism of Mr. Pryor.
Sir Robert Mark, yes, he's ex-Commissioner of Police. Therefore, his views on the police and on the enforcement of the law in this country are very important. His views on other subjects are, of course, his own, like anybody else in this country. I said I thought that he made somewhat exaggerated comments about the Labour Party, and also that he made some exaggerated comments, very exaggerated comments, about the Tories. I said I didn't mind the first and I didn't like the second, and nothing that you've said has made me change my view. I do not accept for one single moment what he says about Jim Pryor.
He has never been to me and asked, when he was the Commissioner of Police at the Metropolis, he never approached me and asked for further laws to be passed on this matter. I'm sure he didn't go to the Home Secretary and ask for further laws to be passed on this matter. He would have had that opportunity and that right to do so if he wished to do it. And if he felt it, or if this is not if he felt it then, why did he not come forward and ask for these matters?
And tonight a union leader gave his reaction, Mr. David Basnett, Secretary of the General and Municipal Workers and a sponsor of the Trade Unions for a Labour Victory campaign. He was surprised Sir Robert Mark didn't understand that corporate bodies such as trade unions had to have some immunity from the law, not granted to individuals so that they could act.
But what's more important is that he totally fails to understand that we live in a society which has got to be run, as far as economic affairs are concerned, by consensus. And in industrial relations, it's better to have agreements that are accepted by employers and trade unions and understandings than the introduction of the law, which in the past has proved to be of very little use in this field at all.
And Sir Robert Mark himself, who's on holiday in Crete, said tonight his article was crystal clear and he had no intention of withdrawing one word of his remarks. He said the article was written 7 or 8 weeks ago, long before any thought of a general election. It wasn't intended to involve or displease any particular party. It was simply the view of an elderly pensioner. Northern Ireland was brought once again into the campaign today by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Hume. In a letter to be read in his diocese on Sunday, he says candidates should be asked for their plans on the future of the province and what fresh start they could offer to a community that suffered so much. Cardinal Hume fears there's a danger that people in England might prefer to ignore what he describes as the agony of Northern Ireland. And to make sure the Prime Minister didn't ignore Ulster, there were hecklers keen to remind him when he began his speech in Cardiff tonight.
Would you please sit down? Would you please sit down, because you only encourage them and give them attention. There may be others who will be scattered among the audience who will say this, so I will say in 3 sentences what British policy is towards Northern Ireland. First of all, 99.9% of the population of that country wish to live in peace together. British policy is to enable them to do so, to keep them together as one community as far as possible, to get agreement among the politicians there about the extent of the powers that can be devolved to Northern Ireland in such a way that neither community will be threatened, and when the election is over, we shall resume that task. Meanwhile, those misguided young people who are shouting today, when they get home quietly tonight and think about it, I wonder whether they are really prepared to defend the murder of a mother of 6 children today by their so-called friends.
The Prime Minister is being subjected to a good deal of such heckling in this campaign. Northern Ireland, even in the midst of it, is an issue that's not going to go away. And finally, one more opinion poll. The latest in tomorrow's Sun newspaper gives the Tories an 8% lead, showing the Conservatives at 40%, Labour at 32%, and the Liberals at 5%. But this poll, unlike some others, includes the don't knows, a striking 22%. Marplan says that the figure for the don't knows represents some 8 million floating voters. The suggestion is, says Marplan, that the parties have everything still to play for.
Our political editor, David Holmes. Latest reports from Uganda speak of further widespread murder and looting by marauding bands of soldiers from Idi Amin's defeated army. Refugees fleeing from areas north and east of Kampala estimate that several hundred people have been killed, many in the town of Tororo. Tanzanian-backed forces of the new Ugandan government have moved out in force to take control, and our correspondent Brian Barron was with the column moving east to Jinja.
Although the Tanzanian and Ugandan units are advancing steadily along the road through Jinja, it's not fast enough to save hundreds of civilians who are reportedly being massacred by Idi Amin's defeated soldiers. It will be at least 3 days before the liberation forces reach Uganda's border with Kenya, 100 miles eastwards along this road. The reason for the caution is that the Tanzanians don't want to risk being outflanked by the few hundred combat troops still loyal to the ousted dictator. These foot-slogging Tanzanians have already walked 200 miles since the invasion began in February. In that time, there hasn't been a single attempt by the Amin forces to rally and defend a fixed position. The reason is simple. Successive purges of the officer corps had robbed them of their dependable leaders. 15 miles east of Kampala, the Liberation Army caught a member of Amin's Gestapo, the State Research Bureau. Because the troops are advancing, the prisoner goes with them. Ultimately, his chances of survival seem slim. In recent days, the Liberation Forces have shot many deserters and fugitives from the Amin army. The prisoner was captured near a police station notorious for officially sanctioned murders in the past 8 years. He's one of the few State Research Bureau operatives to be captured. Most have been killed or they fled deeper into the bush. A captain in the Liberation Army talked about atrocities by Amin troops in eastern Uganda.
They are looting, killing innocent people.
What about prisoners?
The prisoner of war? Oh, we are not doing anything. If at all we question them, we release them.
Have you taken many prisoners so far?
Oh, very many of them.
Any senior officers? Any of Idi Amin's commanders?
Oh, yes. We have got also commanders of these Air Force and also some of them captains. They are now with us.
What happens if you find that any of these Idi Amin soldiers have committed atrocities?
Well, they will be tried in court of law.
You don't try them on the spot?
Not yet. No, we don't do that.
When do you think that the advance will be over and that the war will be finished?
Well, I think this is going to take time because we are moving on foot, and therefore it might take us about 1 or 1.5 months.
In a sense, the Tanzanian victory has shifted the balance of power in East Africa. The myth of Ugandan military strength has been exploded. For the moment, Tanzania is the strongest state. This is Brian Barron on the road through Jinja.
After the third day of Rhodesia's first one-man, one-vote elections, more than half the electorate is reported to have voted. The transitional government under Mr. Ian Smith, an early voter today, now seems set to fulfill its hopes for a high turnout overall when the elections end on Saturday. Now that an American judge has awarded compensation of £50,000 to the woman who lived with actor Lee Marvin, the question remains, who won? Neither Mr. Marvin nor Miss Michelle Triola Marvin have any doubts.
I'm happy that I won something, and I think the next woman will win exactly what she was asking for. I'm not necessarily disappointed.
Let me say this, that I am absolutely excited by the decision. I couldn't have hoped for more. They lost on every charge, on every one.
Will this change your lifestyle in any way?
Well, it'll probably make a leading man out of me.
You know, let's face it, I want to go back to living my life.
You haven't thought really what you're going to do with $104,000?
Pay some bills. Get my car fixed.
The reappearance of the Times and Sunday Times seems as far away as ever, now that the key print union, the National Graphical Association, have, as expected, turned down the management's offer to go to arbitration. But the NGA have made a new offer to the management. They say that if their members are reinstated, they'll guarantee uninterrupted production while talks on new technology continue. Prakash Merchandani reports.
The membership unanimously endorsed their executive's decision and agreed to man picket lines soon. They were also told about a new approach made to the Times management, an offer that would result in 40% redundancies.
We're perfectly prepared to continue publication of the Times as from when they so desire. They could have had it as from the 17th, as far as we're concerned. Indeed, we made that offer to them. To reproduce the Times, because the new technology is not yet ready for operation in any event, whether we agreed or whether we hadn't. And in fact, to give them a guarantee, an assurance of continuous production on the Times and on the Sunday Times, while negotiations continue. But we're not prepared to accept arbitration on an issue of principle.
So 4 months and £15 million later, the Times is coming under siege. The pickets won't be out for a few days yet, but tomorrow's crucial meeting of journalists could add another chapter to an already deteriorating situation.
Dunlop's factory at Speke on Merseyside closed today, leaving over 2,000 workers redundant. But after a mass meeting, 700 of them decided to fight the closure and will picket the factory and other Dunlop plants. The closure came on the day Dunlop announced a £14 million drop in pre-tax profits. Finally, in the United States, people are lining up to be terrified by what's called the Beast. Martin Bell reports from Cincinnati, Ohio, on the world's largest roller coaster.
They shed the candy floss image years ago. Amusement parks here compete with each other in the size and ferocity of their creations. The big craze is for roller coasters, and so the Beast was born. It runs for nearly 1.5 miles through the woods and ravines of a 35-acre site. It cost $3.5 million to build, and it takes you up a hill even steeper than the inflation rate to the top of a 135-foot drop. It plunges you into a hole in the ground at 70 miles an hour, and that's only the second biggest roller coaster drop in the world. The biggest is still ahead of you. 141 feet, this one, at a shallower angle, but with a high-speed turn at the end of it through 628 degrees. You would think this might put people off. It doesn't, it just draws them in. So much so that on opening day there was nearly a riot at the entrance. Why should anyone want to ride this monster? For the obvious reason, because it's there. And the bigger the coaster, apparently, the bigger the thrill. The last coaster craze was 50 years ago, just before the Depression, when this country had 1,500 roller coasters. But none of these on anything like the scale of the beast. The biggest, baddest, longest, fastest coaster in the world. That's what they call it, and who'd be cowardly enough to resist such a challenge? Here's someone who would, Martin Bell in Kings Island, Cincinnati.
My own reaction exactly. Now, the main points of the news again. 2 more people have been killed in Northern Ireland, a woman prison officer and a part-time army cadet captain. Film taken by guerrillas in El Salvador shows the 2 kidnapped British bankers under heavy guard, but apparently in reasonable shape. Unemployment is down by 61,000, the second biggest fall since the war. And the unemployment figures themselves have been one of the main topics in today's election campaign. Well, that's the news tonight. Good night.